1949 would prove to be a crucial year in the Cold War. The United States has atomic weapons, and Joseph Stalin desperately wants one. In order to win the Cold War, the Soviet Union must become an atomic power to match the United States. Joseph Stalin orders spies into the US military. These spies successfully steal the plans to build an atomic bomb. And so in 1949, the Soviet Union becomes an atomic power when it test detonates its own atomic bomb. This is the beginning of the arms race. Once the Soviets had the bomb, the nuclear age had begun. The United States and the Soviet Union were the world's two nuclear superpowers. To once again gain an advantage over the Soviet Union, the United States develops and test detonates its first hydrogen bomb in 1952. The hydrogen bomb is 1 million tons of TNT. Imagine the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan at the end of World War II. A hydrogen bomb is 67 times the power of the bomb that destroyed and annihilated the city of Hiroshima in 1945. However, by 1953, the Soviets test detonate their own H-bomb. Throughout the arms race, the United States and the Soviet Union stockpile nuclear arms in order to top each other. Throughout the course of the 4 decades of the Cold War, these two superpowers would stockpile thousands of nuclear weapons. The negligence and irresponsibility of stockpiling such destructive weapons is lost on the world's two superpowers in their quest for power and influence around the globe. And it places the world in a very dangerous situation.
The massive stockpiling of weapons brought about the policy of brinkmanship. Brinkmanship was a Cold War policy that threatened all-out nuclear war in order to deter the Soviets. Deterrence is a defensive policy, where if we threaten to use our weapons, the Soviets wouldn't want to use theirs. There were 3 parts to brinkmanship. It was created by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles. Both the United States and the Soviet Union cut their land and sea forces. In exchange, they built up their air forces in order to use it to drop bombs on each other. Land forces would become irrelevant with nuclear weapons, therefore creating a necessity to build a stronger air force. Brinkmanship brought about the policy of MAD, or Mutual Assured Destruction. Under this policy, any nuclear attack would be returned in kind, meaning if the Soviet Union dropped an atomic bomb on the United States would drop another atomic bomb on the Soviet Union. This would continue until the entire world was destroyed. While showing force with atomic weapons, Eisenhower turned to the CIA for covert ops. The Central Intelligence Agency used spies for espionage and secret missions abroad. In 1951, the CIA begins covert missions to weaken or overthrow unfriendly governments. The first country targeted was Iran. The CIA funded the overthrow of the Muslim prime minister, so a pro-US Shah could return. Another country in which the CIA was influential was Guatemala. The CIA trained a rebel army to bring down the pro-communist Guatemalan government. With the success of using Guatemalan rebels, the CIA will use this tactic again in trying to overthrow Fidel Castro from Cuba. The goal of CIA covert operations in the 1950s was to install pro-US governments and preventing unstable nations from going communist.
In 1953, Joseph Stalin dies, and the United States and the Soviet Union enter a period of time where their relationship improved and tensions in the Cold War calmed. However, a series of international crises would reignite the tensions in the Cold War to even a higher level. The first of these crises was the formation of the Warsaw Pact. When West Germany rearmed itself and joined NATO, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The Warsaw Pact was a defensive alliance of its own, made up between the Soviet Union and 7 satellite nations in Eastern Europe. These nations were East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Warsaw Pact threatened war with any Western democracy if NATO attacked any of the countries that belonged to the Warsaw Pact. With Europe divided between NATO countries in the West and Warsaw Pact countries in the East, the battle lines were drawn across Europe. Any little event could spark a war between democracy and communism and plunge Europe into a potential nuclear conflict. The second crisis was the Hungarian Revolution. In 1956, the people of Hungary revolt against the Soviet Union and tried to establish a democratic government. The United States initially promised the Hungarian revolutionaries aid in their fight against the Soviets. However, if the United States directly involved itself in the conflict, it risked all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and so, despite their promises, sent no aid to the revolutionaries. The Hungarian revolt is put down by Soviet troops, and Hungary remains part of the communist bloc.
The other crisis that increased tensions was the Suez Crisis in 1956. Egypt, backed out of the Soviets, cut off all access to the Suez Canal in order to cut off oil to Western democracies. In retaliation to this, England, France, and Israel invade Egypt to regain control of the Suez and restore the oil flow. The Suez Crisis ended when the UN intervened to negotiate peace. The brief war ended with a Western withdrawal and Egyptian control of the Suez. Eisenhower was disturbed by the Soviet influence in the Middle East, and he wanted to stop it. If the Soviets can spread to the Middle East, they'll control oil and important trade routes. So in 1957, the United States adopts the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine pledges the U.S. would fully defend the Middle East from any communist attack. The Eisenhower Doctrine officially spread the policy of containment to the Middle East. This would dictate U.S. involvement in the region for the next 60 years.
The 1950s also gave birth to a new era in the renewed rivalry between the Soviet Union and the United States. In 1953, the new Soviet premier Nikita Khrushchev changes the game entirely. In addition to the military rivalry between the two superpowers, Nikita Khrushchev also wanted to prove Soviet superiority culturally, and so he began an economic and scientific competition with the United States. With Khrushchev's push for scientific dominance, the Soviets changed the game in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik. Sputnik was the first satellite launched into space by mankind, and the Soviets had done it. By winning the race to space, the United States needed to catch up. With the fear that they were falling behind in the competition with the Soviet Union, the United States launched its own satellite into space in 1958. The rivalry reached heightened tension in 1960 with the U-2 incident. A U.S. high-altitude spy plane called a U-2 was shot down over the Soviet Union, and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured. Powers was put on trial in the Soviet Union and was convicted of espionage on behalf of the United States. The United States openly admitted that it was spying on the Soviet Union, because quite frankly, the Soviet Union was also spying on the United States at the same time. But the United States refused to apologize, which broke down negotiations between the two countries and brought tensions to a fever pitch. By 1960, Dwight D. Eisenhower was finishing his second term as President of the United States. Over his presidency, defense spending had rose 40% in order to keep up with the Soviets. Before leaving office, Ike warned of the influence of what he called the industrial military complex. In his farewell address to the nation, Eisenhower expressed his fear that in the race to beat the Soviets, the United States was sacrificing too much.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
In his view, the government was relying on the power of the military and massive defense spending way too much. He feared that the stockpiling of weapons and the race to outspend the Soviets in military defense would endanger the rights of citizens. The United States would become so obsessed to build up its military that the priorities of the individual citizen, their well-being, their prosperity would be sacrificed. It was a candid moment when President Eisenhower put aside his political affiliations and gave advice for what he thought was best for his country. Despite his remarkable warning, the stage was set for an escalation in the 1960s that would bring the world to the brink of annihilation and the closest it has ever been to all-out international nuclear war.